Judge Prescott mocked Stallone's cross as nothing more than a stage prop. But he never expected the man behind decades of roles to strip the courtroom bare, not with performance, but with unwavering faith. Stay with us to discover what happened. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story. The courthouse doors groaned open at precisely 8 a.m., letting in a thin mist of Florida rain that clung to the polished tile like breath on glass. The reporters were already in place, murmuring into handheld mics and brushing water off notepads. Some glanced up. Then all of them did. Sylvester Stallone stepped inside. His gait was steady, slow, like someone who had spent his whole life walking into rooms where no one wanted him there. His dark suit clung slightly to his shoulders from the drizzle. The collar of his black shirt opened just enough to show the curve of a small gold cross resting against his chest. Camera shutters fluttered. A few phones came up despite the signs. One reporter whispered, "He's really doing it, representing himself." Another nodded, already recording. He didn't look at them, not the cameras, not the crowd. His eyes stayed forward, locked on the judge's bench, the weight of something older than pride in his posture. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was quiet, not reverent, not hostile, just paused. Judge Alan Prescott sat perched behind the bench, every inch the image of judicial control. Clean lines, cold stare, no trace of warmth. As Stallone moved toward the defendant's table, the judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Stallone," he said, voice measured, almost too casual to be casual. "Before we proceed, I must ask, please remove your cross. This is a neutral space." The words dropped like a gavel, though he hadn't lifted one. Stallone stopped. He looked up, just a fraction. Not startled, not tense. He just tilted his head, as if the question had come from a stranger on the street. "With respect, sir," he said quietly, "that's not just a cross." The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was locked. No movement, no scribbling. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered an inch above her keyboard, waiting for the judge to speak again. Prescott shifted. His tone hardened. "I'm sure you're aware, Mr. Stallone, that this courtroom maintains a standard of neutrality. Religious symbols are a distraction. You'll need to remove it." Stallone blinked once. Then he took his seat, slow and silent. He didn't touch the cross, didn't even glance at it. He just sat, upright, shoulders back, eyes fixed on the bench like he was staring through the wood and into something deeper. The judge sighed, almost theatrically. "Noted. Let the record show that Mr. Stallone has declined to comply with the court's request. The court issues a formal warning for non-compliance." Stallone didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because the moment he entered that room, the lawsuit against him, contracts, clauses, corporate demands, had already started to fade. The fight was no longer about a film deal. It wasn't even about money. It was about who gets to decide what stays close to your heart, and who has the right to strip it from you. And Sylvester Stallone had made one thing very clear. He wasn't here to take anything off. The cameras were still rolling. They weren't supposed to, not inside a courtroom. But with someone like Sylvester Stallone on the witness stand, rules tended to blur at the edges. A network crew had been granted limited coverage, background only, the judge had said. But everyone knew lenses could shift, and they had. Stallone sat tall, hands folded in his lap, jaw set in that familiar way the world had seen 1,000 times before. But there was nothing rehearsed here. The lighting didn't flatter him. There was no makeup, no angle correction. Just a man who had built a life on screen, now fighting for something no script could give. Across from him, the attorney for Orion Vista, sleek in a navy suit, leaned back with practiced indifference. His voice held the kind of derision that only came from lawyers who thought a courtroom was still their stage. "Mr. Stallone, it's admirable, I suppose, that you've chosen to represent yourself," he said, tone laced with a grin, but refusing a direct instruction from the bench. It doesn't exactly scream cooperation. Stallone didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the cross on his chest, then slowly up to meet the man's stare. "I've followed rules my whole life," he said. "Rules of set, rules of press, rules of contracts. But this isn't about cooperation. It's about not leaving behind what saved me." The attorney smirked. "You mean that necklace?" "No." Stallone's voice dropped, steady as a war drum. "I mean my mother." A beat of silence passed. Even the court reporter looked up. "I wore this cross when I walked into a rehab clinic at 49, he continued. "After the fame dried up, after I couldn't feel anything but noise, I had a closet full of awards and a heart that couldn't sleep. That cross?" He touched it gently. "It's what my mother gave me when I told her I wanted to give up. She said, 'You don't need the whole world to believe in you. Just him.'" Judge Prescott shifted slightly. "Mr. Stallone," he said, tone tightening, "this isn't a confessional. It's a courtroom. Let's not confuse the two." Stallone paused. Then I looked straight at the bench. "This isn't a church, Mr. Stallone," Prescott repeated, louder. "Neither is it a place to shame faith," Stallone replied, without raising his voice. It hit harder that way. A silence rippled out. Even the murmurs from the gallery stilled. Then came the sound, a soft click from a phone camera. No one turned toward it. No one had to. They all heard it. Somewhere, someone had just captured the moment. The judge leaned back, lips pressed in a line. "You're walking a fine line, sir." Stallone nodded once. "I've walked worse." And then, before anyone could stop him, he stood, slowly, without permission, a quiet shift of cloth and breath. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a folded paper, worn at the edges. He opened it with care, as if it were scripture. "Tinker versus Des Moines, 1969, he said. "Supreme Court. Students wore black armbands to protest war. The court ruled they didn't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate, and I sure as hell haven't shed mine walking into this room." Prescott narrowed his eyes. "You are not a student, and this is not a protest." "It's a principle," Stallone replied. "Same one." The room held its breath, not just because of what was said, but because of who said it and how. The judge's face hardened. "Enough. You've made your point. A formal fine will be issued for willful defiance of court instruction." Stallone exhaled softly, refolding the paper and sliding it back into his coat. Then he looked up. Not angry, not smug, just still. "You can fine me," he said, "but you can't erase me." And when he sat back down, the room remained silent, not out of obedience, but out of awe. Wyoming, the air inside the office of Orion Vista's headquarters pulsed with that peculiar corporate brand of panic, measured, well-dressed, and expensive. The coffee in the boardroom had gone cold, untouched since the hearing ended 5 hours earlier. He turned a civil dispute into a crusade. The director of PR slammed her palm against the polished table, scattering the stack of early morning press clippings. One had a photo of Stallone mid-sentence, cross visible, courtroom frozen behind him. Another was already being mocked up into a magazine cover. The headline, "The Man Who Wouldn't Bow." Across from her, the general counsel adjusted his tie. "It was supposed to be about breach of contract," he muttered. "The cross wasn't in the script, literally." "It is now," she snapped. Because by mid-morning, the courtroom moment had broken the internet. A shaky cell phone video, no longer than 30 seconds, had captured the exact moment Stallone said, "You can fine me, but you can't erase me." That was all it took. Within 2 hours, #StandWithStallone was trending nationwide. A clip of his quote was retweeted by a retired Marine general with 3 million followers. A bishop from New York called him a symbol of silent resistance. A rabbi in Chicago compared him to the prophets who stood before kings. Even a well-known atheist columnist had written, "Whether or not you believe in God, you should believe in the right to carry conviction into a courtroom." The story had left the courthouse. Now it was everywhere. and Judge Alan Prescott knew it. From the shadows of his chambers, he picked up the phone, direct line only, and called the same corporate lawyer who had once negotiated the contract Stallone was now defending himself against. "You need to shut this down," Prescott said flatly, "before he becomes a martyr." There was a pause. "With respect, Judge," came the response. "We don't control social media. You control the narrative. Do it before it's too late." And so, somewhere between legal strategy and damage control, a memo was born, strictly internal, marked confidential. But nothing stayed buried long in a digital age. By late afternoon, someone had leaked it. The memo accused Stallone of manufacturing spectacle, of disrupting proceedings with calculated defiance, of deliberately endangering the credibility of judicial impartiality. Screenshots of the email burned through inboxes, onto news feeds, and into hashtags. Commentators read it aloud on air with tones of disbelief, even contempt. One analyst scoffed. "So we punish people for being too visible now?" Prescott said nothing publicly. He didn't have to. The memo said enough. But that night, under mounting pressure, a carefully worded statement arrived from the National Guild of Performers. "We affirm every artist's right to legal representation and personal expression," it read. "While we do not comment on active disputes, we encourage all members to resolve conflicts with professionalism and discretion." The message was clear. We see you, but don't push this further. And somewhere across town, alone in his apartment above the harbor, Stallone sat at his desk. No cameras, no crowds, just a man and the quiet hum of the city below. The cross he wore in court lay now on the table in front of him. He hadn't taken it off for years, but tonight he'd removed it, not in surrender, but to study it. As if to ask it a question it had already answered. The glow from the window caught its edges in gold. Stallone stared at it for a long time. Then finally he whispered, as if to the memory of every time he had stayed silent in the past. "Not this time." Footsteps approached down the hallway. Light, careful. Lauren stepped in, her face pale with hesitation. "Good morning," she said softly. He nodded, once. The kind of nod that said, "Just say it." "They're moving forward," she said, voice low. "Prescott filed the complaint with the ethics board. Last night." He didn't speak. His face didn't shift. But inside, something coiled. She hesitated, then placed a manila envelope on the table. The seal on it was heavy with implication. "And Lighthouse canceled." That one hit deeper. Sylvester looked away toward the kitchen window, not out of denial, but out of exhaustion. "Did they say why?" "Timing," she said. "But it's not that." He exhaled through his nose, slow and hard. "They're afraid," he murmured. She nodded. He stood, quietly. The chair scraped the floor with a sound that felt too loud in the quiet kitchen. As he walked toward the hallway, she followed without words. He stopped in front of a shelf where old scripts sat, bound and yellowing. He ran a thumb along one of them. It was from a film he'd walked away from once, when the studio tried to rewrite his character's entire story arc. That time, it cost him millions. This time, it was going to cost more. Later that morning, two longtime friends came by. They sat in the den, where framed posters lined the walls, Rocky, First Blood, Copland. The air smelled of worn leather and old books. One of them was a producer, the other, a retired screenwriter. Both had grayer hair than they remembered, and more caution in their eyes than Stallone had ever seen. "This is getting big, Sly," one said, his voice careful. "You've got every headline, every camera. You made your point." "You proved something," the other added. "Now, let it go." Stallone listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. When they finished, he sat back, resting one hand on the armrest, the other still. His face was unreadable. Then he said it, softly but clearly. "You want to survive," he said, You play it safe. His fingers tapped the wood once, twice, then stopped. But you want to matter. He looked at them now, really looked. You stand up. No one answered, not because they disagreed, but because they knew he wasn't asking. That afternoon, the house was quiet again. He walked to his office. The air was still, the blinds half closed. A dusty silence hung in the corners. On the desk sat his phone. Next to it, a small leather-bound notebook, notes from a time when he thought his legacy would be written by others. But not anymore. He scrolled through the contacts, pausing at one name. Lisa Reynolds. They hadn't spoken in years. He pressed the button. The phone rang twice. Then her voice came through, familiar as gravel. "Lisa," he said, his voice steady now. "I'm done letting them write the story." There was a beat. Then she answered, sharp as ever. "Tell me where to start." The studio lights were softer than usual. No dramatic backdrops, no swelling music cues, no clever cuts. Just a chair, a mic, a silence heavy enough to be felt through the screen. Lisa Reynolds sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, the way seasoned interviewers did when they knew the next words might matter more than anything said all week. "Why didn't you walk away?" she asked. The camera panned slightly, catching the lines around Sylvester Stallone's eyes, the kind of lines that don't come from aging, but from carrying too much for too long. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he inhaled through his nose, slow, deep. Then let it go. "When my son died," he began, voice low and gravel thick, "I remember staring at the floor for 2 days straight. Couldn't eat, couldn't move. I had all these letters from fans, from friends, but nothing reached me." Lisa didn't interrupt. The control room behind the glass didn't blink. "I was in the kitchen, and I found a bottle of scotch someone left behind. I picked it up without thinking. Like I used to." He let out a breath, not a sigh, just an old breath that had been waiting. But my hand hit something else on the counter. It was this. He reached into his pocket and held up the gold cross. It clinked against the glass, and I thought, what if this little thing still has a purpose? There was a tremble in his voice, not weakness, but memory. "I've had fame, more than I ever deserved. I've stood in front of roaring crowds and been called a legend, but nothing is lonelier than being celebrated and still feeling like no one sees who you really are." Lisa's eyes didn't waver. "And who are you now?" Stallone looked straight at the camera then, not for effect, not to perform, as if he was searching for someone out there in the dark to speak to. "I'm a man who still believes in things, even when they get you fined in court." The line hit harder than any punch he'd thrown on screen. Across the country, in living rooms and diner booths, on phones and radios, people listened. Some paused mid-bite, others mid-thought. Politicians quoted him. Musicians reposted him. A preacher in South Carolina began his Sunday sermon with, "You can fine him, but you can't erase him." Wow. The backlash that had once threatened to crush him began to turn in his favor. The public saw not a defiant actor, but a weathered father, a man who had known loss and refused to trade principle for peace. Within 48 hours, the ethics complaint against Stallone had become an embarrassment. The narrative shifted. Instead of labeling him disruptive, commentators began to question the silence around Prescott's overreach. And then it happened. A single letter, signed by 14 senior attorneys from across the country, former judges, constitutional scholars, civil rights veterans. It was published in full-page spreads in major newspapers. "We, the undersigned, affirm that Mr. Stallone's stance is not only legally protected, it is morally necessary. In defending the right to personal faith in a public space, he has reminded us of the quiet courage the law was designed to uphold." Back in his apartment, Stallone sat on the edge of his bed, the television muted. He didn't smile when the segment aired. He didn't fist pump or stand. He just watched. Then turned to the cross, now resting on the windowsill. The sky outside was beginning to blue with the first light of morning. He whispered something, not for the camera, not even for himself, but perhaps for the boy he lost, or the mother who gave him that chain, or the God he still reached for in silence. Then he reached for a pen, unfolded a sheet of paper, and began to write. Not a script, not a speech, but maybe something stronger. A promise. The hallway was quieter than he expected. No footsteps, no reporters shouting his name, no camera flashes to sting the corners of his vision. Just the dull hum of fluorescent lights, the low squeak of rubber soles on polished floors, and the faint echo of a verdict that would follow him far longer than any headline. Sylvester Stallone stood at the threshold of courtroom 3B, the oak door still half open behind him. For a moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, letting the air settle around his shoulders like a coat he hadn't worn in years. The inside of the room behind him felt colder now, as if the final words spoken there had taken all the warmth and left only the echo. Judge Alan Prescott has been found in violation of ethical conduct, the clerk had read, her voice even, almost practiced. Disciplinary action will include formal censure and reassignment. No fireworks, no shouts, just a sentence. A sentence that felt like both an end and a beginning. And Stallone, he didn't flinch. Not when the judgment was announced. Not when the press release from Orion Vista blinked across the courtroom monitors, offering an apology for any distress caused to Mr. Stallone and reaffirming our respect for all forms of personal expression. Not even when the Legal Association issued a statement of its own. Religious symbols, when worn discreetly and without disruption, are not grounds for disciplinary action in a court of law. He had won, but he didn't feel like a victor. He stepped forward now, slow and heavy, each movement deliberate. Not because of age or weariness, but because he understood, deep in the core of his chest, that this moment wasn't just his. It belonged to something larger. He passed the gallery benches, empty now. Minutes ago, they had been filled with lawyers, clerks, press. All of them had gone. But the feeling remained, like heat on a stove long after the flame is gone. The doors to the courthouse lobby opened as he approached, pushed wide by two officers who didn't speak but simply nodded. And that's when he saw them. A line of people. Silent. Still. On either side of the marble corridor they stood, not with signs, not with shouts, but with something quieter, something heavier. A presence born not of noise, but of reverence. Men in suits, women in cardigans, elderly veterans with folded hands, mothers holding children, teens in hoodies with phones lowered for once. They didn't cheer, they didn't move, they just watched. And Stallone, without saying a word, paused. He looked down at his chest. The gold cross, now glinting under the high glass ceiling, rested right where it had always been, right above the heart. He didn't touch it, didn't lift it. He simply placed his palm flat over it, fingers spread, firm, like a promise made in silence. That was enough. He took another step, and then another, until a voice, soft and high, broke the hush behind him. "Dad," it said, barely louder than a whisper. "Who is that?" A man turned, wore a dark hat. His hand rested on the shoulder of a boy no older than 7. The father leaned close, his voice steady. "That," he said, "is a man who didn't bow." The boy nodded, his small face turned to watch the slow steps of a man who had once faced scripts and spotlights, and now had faced a system built to bend him. But he hadn't bent. And as Stallone pushed through the last door and into the gray light of afternoon, he didn't look back. Because he knew. This wasn't about being right. It was about standing. The studio lights were softer than courtroom fluorescence, diffused through mesh panels that warmed the frame without washing him out. Still, Sylvester Stallone squinted slightly as he adjusted the collar of his jacket. He sat on a padded stool across from the podcast host, microphone angled just below his chin, and waited for the red light to blink. It had been months since the hearing, months since the firestorm, since the camera flash outside the courthouse caught him stepping into a taxi with his cross still hanging in place and his face unreadable. The story had slowed, as all stories do, swallowed by newer headlines, younger names, louder dramas. But the questions never stopped. Today, he was here not to revisit the battle, but to tell the truth in the way he always had, slowly, from the gut, with a voice scratched by time and softened by memory. The host cleared her throat. "Mr. Stallone, I think what people really want to know is, why? Why take that risk? Why go it alone when you could have just complied and moved on?" He let the question breathe. Then he leaned slightly forward, folding his fingers in front of him, not like a man about to defend himself, but like someone preparing to share something he'd carried for too long. "It wasn't about the cross," he said quietly. "Not really. It was about what happens to a man when he starts handing over pieces of himself to stay polite, to stay employable, to stay quiet." A pause. "Because if you give up your voice once," he continued, "you may never find it again." The room fell into a gentle stillness. He didn't elaborate with legal theory or media spin. He didn't name Prescott. He didn't even mention the fine, the backlash, the endorsement deals that dried up overnight. That was noise. This was what mattered. He blinked slowly. "I've stood on a lot of stages, accepted awards I didn't think I deserved, said lines other people wrote. But that moment, in the courtroom, that was the first time in a long time I said something that was only mine." The host leaned back. "Do you think it changed anything?" Stallone gave a small smile, one that barely reached the corners of his eyes. "Maybe not everything, but enough." He didn't say it, but the world already knew. The new film had premiered just a week earlier. Iron Mercy, it was called. A small-budget project with no franchise, no explosions, no digital double. Just a quiet, aging mechanic trying to stop a greedy developer from evicting a row of immigrant families. There was a courtroom scene in the third act. The dialogue wasn't subtle. The cross he wore in the film? His own. It didn't win awards. It didn't need to. People had shown up. Not for spectacle, but for something rarer. Truth that felt lived in. And then there was the book. Crossfire. When Justice Forgot Grace. Co-authored with a constitutional lawyer and a journalist who'd been covering the case since day one. It wasn't a tell-all. It was a meditation. A slow walk through memory, mistake, and moral ground. Every chapter ended with a single sentence in bold. "You are not powerless if you still speak." He didn't promote it much. He didn't have to. It found the people who needed it. The podcast wrapped quietly. No applause, no standing ovation. Just a nod of thanks, a hand on his shoulder, and a quiet ride home. That night, at a small chapel just outside the city, no press, no photographers, Stallone knelt before a low marble altar. The wood-paneled walls carried the smell of incense and thyme. Candles flickered at the edges of the room. In the center stood a Beilua memorial, a place where visitors could place tokens of loss, or remembrance, or renewal. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the cross. He didn't look at it long. He didn't need to. The weight of it was etched into him now, not his neck. He stepped forward and set it gently on the edge of the flame basin, not to leave it behind, but to let it shine. And as he turned away, the light caught on the gold one last time, casting not a shadow, but a quiet, defiant glow. And that was the legacy, the quiet, final chapter of a man who once stood in front of millions and chose, in the end, to stand for something greater than applause. If Stallone's story moved you, if it reminded you that courage doesn't always roar, sometimes it simply refuses to bow, then take a moment to let that light stay with you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that linger long after the screen fades to black. And tell us in the comments, what would you stand for, even if it cost you everything? Until next time, stay grounded, stay brave, and keep your voice. All stories on this channel are fictional and for entertainment only. We believe in equal rights for all and aim to share messages of kindness, fairness, and dignity. Any similarities to real people or events are purely coincidental. These stories are free of political or religious intent and are designed to inspire, not to reflect or represent real-world entities.